Russia had completely spun out of control from the very first weeks of 1905. Each day another factory went on strike. Workers poured into the streets, and the squares turned almost into scenes of apocalypse. As a result of the reaction and impact created by Bloody Sunday, the Russian people were now in the streets in an unstoppable way. Every day brought news of a new clash or uprising, and neither state officials nor members of the dynasty felt safe anymore. In a Russia dominated by chaos, the workers were now out of control. Interior Minister Alexander Bulygin, who went to meet the Tsar, explained the gravity of the situation. Worker uprisings and revolutionary demonstrations had spread as far as the villages. As Bulygin expressed his concern about the condition of the peasants, the Tsar interrupted him. "Bulygin, one would think you fear a revolution is about to break out." Bulygin gave only one reply to these words: "Your Majesty, the revolution has already begun." Even before the war with Japan, Russia was in a disastrous state. The influence and following of revolutionary groups had steadily grown, and many anti-regime organizations had emerged. Revolutionary socialists, social democrats, liberals, narodniks, and many others had become far more demanding. Political assassinations were at their peak. In the centuries-long history of Russia, this was perhaps the worst possible time to be Minister of the Interior. Interior Minister Dmitry Sipyagin was shot in the back and killed in 1902 at the Mariinsky Palace by the revolutionary Stepan Balmashov. His successor, Vyacheslav von Pleva, did not last long in the post either. Evno Azev, a Jewish-born double agent planted among revolutionaries by the Okhrana, had set his sights on Pleva, who had remained indifferent to the pogrom in Kishinev in 1903 and, according to some sources, had even asked the police not to intervene. After a series of failed attempts, Pleva was killed in July 1904 when a bomb thrown at his carriage by revolutionary students, an operation organized by Azev, exploded. At that time, Azev was in a very difficult position among the revolutionary socialists. Suspicions that he was an agent were increasing, and he was cornered. By organizing the assassination of Interior Minister Pleva, who was also seen as responsible for the events in Kishinev, Azev, himself Jewish, would both avenge the Jews and dispel the suspicions surrounding him. With one stone, he killed two birds, and for the moment, secured his position within the organization. All these assassinations were, in fact, signs of the approaching storm. The Tsar and the Imperial family decided to increase security measures and withdraw into the palace. Except in cases of absolute necessity, no one would leave. In such an atmosphere, the war was also continuing. Pyotr Mirsky, who became Minister of the Interior after Pleva's assassination, held liberal views. His first move was to purge Pleva's cadres. Tsar Nicholas, who seemed to grasp the seriousness of the situation, at least to some extent, viewed Mirsky's reform proposals favorably. Mirsky advised the Tsar in particular to establish a legislative assembly, hoping this would ease tensions and at least keep Russia sliding downhill on the road. However, Nicholas, as always indecisive and constantly changing his mind, ignored the calls for reform. The Tsar still clung to the hope that repression and control would yield results. Yet there was a serious problem he overlooked. The workers' movement in St. Petersburg had grown considerably and was becoming increasingly active. At the forefront of this movement stood a priest. This clergyman, named Georgy Gapon, was also cooperating with a liberal opposition organization called the Union of Liberation, founded in 1904. The Union of Liberation's representatives in St. Petersburg regularly provided Gapon with liberal propaganda materials and encouraged him to push workers not only to demand economic improvements, but also to pressure the Tsar for political reforms. From December 1904 onward, Gapon had the idea of organizing a march in his mind. In secret meetings, he expressed his desire to present a petition to the Tsar that included demands for political rights. But he remained uncertain about the timing. Another defeat in the Russo-Japanese War could be expected, yet that meant an uncertain date. The event that created the opportunity Gapon was seeking took place at the Putilov Ironworks, one of Russia's largest factories. In early December, 4 workers were dismissed without cause for being members of the St. Petersburg Assembly of Factory Workers. When the assembly member workers objected, the factory director Smirnov replied, "Go and let your assembly solve your problems." The workers then went to the assembly presided over by Gapon and explained the situation. Although Gapon objected, Smirnov regarded both Gapon and the assembly he represented with hostility. If a solution could not be found, the assembly itself would lose credibility. Realizing that negotiations with the factory would lead nowhere, Gapon and the workers' assembly decided to strike. But this would not be the strike of a single factory. The strike decision was, in effect, the last drop that made the cup overflow. On January 3rd, workers at the Putilov Factory went on strike under Gapon's leadership. This was only the beginning. Thousands of workers from dozens of factories in similar circumstances joined the strike in a very short time. Almost all factories in the city were affected. The operations of nearly 400 enterprises came to a complete halt, and 2/3 of the workforce was lost. Realizing that the right moment for a march had arrived, Gapon spent 3 days and nights revising the petition and held meetings with nearly 50 different worker groups to discuss the details of the march. Gapon told the workers, "The Tsar is a good man. If we can explain the troubles of the Russian people, he will help them." When asked what would happen if he did not, his answer was clear: "Then we have no Tsar." The march was now on the verge of taking place. Workers gathered in the assembly listened to Gapon's fiery sermons, and as the clauses to be added to the petition were put to a vote, they made the sign of the cross with their fingers. The petition, written in a peaceful tone, ended with these words: "Here, my lord, are our needs. Command us. Swear that you will fulfill them, and you will make Russia both happy and glorious. Your name will be engraved forever in our hearts and in those of our descendants. If you do not command, if you do not answer our plea, then here, in this square, before your palace, we shall die. We have nowhere else to go and no reason to go anywhere else. We have only 2 paths, either to freedom and happiness or to the grave. Let our lives be sacrificed for suffering Russia. We are not sorry for this sacrifice. We make it willingly." Thousands of Russians, preparing to march with their families beside them, begged their little father Tsar for help and hoped that he would save them. Among state officials, however, confusion reigned. According to those officials who examined the petition, the demands were absolutely unacceptable. Yet the presence of Gapon at the head of the march was seen as a relative advantage. A clergyman was leading the procession. If Gapon were arrested, they might lose a priest capable of controlling events. As this uncertainty continued, on the eve of the march, the liberal representative Yosif Vladimirovich Gessen went to meet Sergei Vita. Gessen warned Vita that the army must under no circumstances intervene in the march, otherwise blood would flow freely and events would spiral out of control. Vita, however, dismissed Gessen, saying he had no influence within the cabinet. The Tsar, too, chose to distance himself from events, going to Tsarskoye Selo because of the rising tension and the march scheduled for the next day. The Sunday that would go down in history had arrived. All the actors had taken their places. On the morning of January 22nd, 1905, workers began gathering in different parts of the city. Some were accompanied by their wives and children. They carried religious icons in their hands and at times sang hymns, at other times patriotic songs, such as God Save the Tsar. Some held portraits of the Tsar. Soldiers had taken precautions against any advance, blocking all roads leading to the square with military units. For a while, believing that the Tsar was in the palace, they marched toward the Winter Palace. According to the plan, they were to meet at Palace Square around 2 o'clock in the afternoon and present their demands to the Tsar. When the group led by Gapon reached the area near the Narva Gate, one of the city's key points, soldiers confronted them. When calls to disperse went unanswered, a few gunshots were heard. In the tense atmosphere, Gapon addressed the crowd. "Forward, comrades! Either freedom or death." Demonstrators in the front ranks began running toward the soldiers. At that moment, a warning trumpet sounded. It was the order to fire. A sudden volley of gunfire was unleashed into the crowd. Some fell to the ground at the very first shots. The scene instantly turned into a sea of blood. Nearly 50 demonstrators were killed in this clash near the Narva Gate. Shocked by the unfolding catastrophe, Gapon began to shout, "There is no God anymore. There is no Tsar anymore." A very similar scenario unfolded at the other assembly points. A march that had begun with entirely peaceful intentions turned into an unimaginable massacre. Thousands who had wanted to lean on the Tsar's chest and cry like children, as they told him their troubles, found themselves, just hours later, wanting to fill that chest with bullets. There were hundreds of wounded and dead, yet the gravest casualty would be the Tsarist regime itself. This event, remembered in history as Bloody Sunday, marked the day a new era began in Russia. For years, many revolutionary organizations had carried out dozens of actions to mobilize workers, peasants, and the people at large. None had generated the energy and fury unleashed by Bloody Sunday. After Bloody Sunday, revolutionaries, conservatives, liberals, in short, every segment of Russian society began to protest. The mass movement was accompanied by a strike epidemic launched by workers to protest Bloody Sunday. In the first weeks following the catastrophe, the number of striking workers in the industrial centers of the Russian Empire exceeded 500,000. The entire Russian people, workers, professionals, local politicians, and many others, united in a powerful front against autocracy. In St. Petersburg alone, 160,000 factory workers walked off the job on January 23rd, the day after the events. Like an avalanche, opposition and strikes spread to Moscow, Riga, Warsaw, Vilna, Kovno, Tiflis, Baku, Batum, and the Baltic cities. By February, 414,000 workers across the Russian Empire were on strike. The regime no longer knew what to do. Some of the Tsar's advisors immediately called for violence. Others recommended a series of reforms. The Tsar himself issued highly inconsistent statements. He would begin the day with a reformist, conciliatory tone, only to declare by evening that the protesters of Bloody Sunday should be punished. The country plunged into an extraordinary state of chaos. One of those who would also be caught up in this chaos was Sergei Alexandrovich Romanov. Grand Duke Sergei was under severe threat because of the Jewish expulsions, the Kodinka tragedy, and the harsh policies he had pursued against revolutionaries. At the beginning of 1905, he resigned from the governorship of Moscow and moved with his family to the Nikolai Palace in Moscow. Assassination warnings arrived almost daily. Rarely venturing outside, Sergei and his family attended a concert at the Bolshoi Theater on February 15th. socialist revolutionaries who were tracking Sergei planned a bomb attack on his carriage. However, when Ivan Kalyaev saw that Sergei's wife and children were also in the vehicle, he called off the assassination. On February 17th, Sergei left the palace to go to the governor's residence and, as if sensing what was to come, asked that no one accompany him. Shortly after leaving the palace, Ivan Kalyaev, who was following Sergei, saw that he was alone and took action. As the carriage passed by the Chudov monastery, Ivan approached and hurled a bomb into Sergei's lap. The explosion was so powerful that it tore the carriage and the Grand Duke to pieces. Sergei was killed instantly, and Kalyaev was arrested. After being sentenced to death, he would declare in court that he was satisfied with the sentence. I hope you will carry out your punishment as openly and publicly as I have carried out the punishment of the Socialist Revolutionary Party. Learn to look the advancing revolution in the face. Kalyaev was right. The revolution was now knocking at Russia's door. On March 2nd, Tsar Nicholas issued a manifesto. Yet this manifesto, too, was deeply problematic. While offering vague promises of reform, it also vowed to punish those responsible for the events. As long as those on strike, in the streets, and at demonstrations did not obtain what they wanted, the unrest would not subside. Nicholas's evasively worded manifestos and half-hearted promises only escalated events further. The number of workers involved in strikes and street actions had grown so large that arresting labor leaders was no longer possible. After a while, the government was even forced to abandon its policy of exiling protest leaders from the cities to the provinces. Operating out of sight in their places of exile, revolutionaries now began to draw the peasantry into rebellion as well. Worst of all for the Tsarist regime was the emergence of similar uprisings within the military. Revolutionaries were present among the crew of the battleship Potemkin. Already worn down by the officers' mistreatment, the sailors were also being served worm-infested meat. On June 27th, the sailors refused to eat the borscht prepared from this food. When the ship's second-in-command, Ippolit Gilyarovsky, threatened to shoot them, the sailors rose up. Gunfire erupted, killing both mutinous crew members and officers. Led by Afanassy Matushenko, the sailors formed a ship's committee and seized control. After the mutiny, the revolutionary sailors took the Potemkin to the port of Odessa, where they were greeted with great enthusiasm. By hoisting a red flag on its deck, the ship became a symbol of the revolution overnight. For a week, Odessa witnessed street protests that steadily drained the energy and morale of an already weakened regime. The violence further emboldened worker resistance. Potemkin did not bring about a revolution on its own, yet the event became both a source of humiliation for the government and a clear sign that similar movements would occur in the future. Russia had become the capital of chaos, anarchy, and revolution. Worse still, this was only the beginning.